Hi guys, in this tutorial we'll see how to call an external API in Angular using get method with parameters, and finally post method. So let's begin. So let's take an example of the get method. So this is our Angular 7 project. This is the app.module. So for making any HTTP request, we have to first import the HttpClient module in our app module. After that, we have to import the HttpClient module in import section. So now I'll create a service for calling an external API. So let's go to our app folder and we'll just create a new folder named as services. And inside the services, we'll create a new file named as freeapi.service.ts. So this is the file where we are going to make the API call. So let's go to our freeapi service.ts file. So first we'll import injectable from Angular core. After doing this, we'll declare a class named as freeAPI service of type injectable. So this is our service which we are going to inject in other components. So now since this is an example of a get API, we are going to take the same external API from the previous tutorial. So this is the get API and it returns a JSON in form of a list, and it has fields like post ID, ID, name, email and body. So we'll create a class which will replicate all these fields. So now in this app folder, I will just right click and create a folder named as classes. And inside the classes, I will create a new file named as comments.ts. And in this comments.ts, I will just replicate all these fields of this API, that is post ID, ID, name, email and body. So let's go to our comments.ts file. We'll just create a class, export class comments, and we'll just create all these fields like post ID, ID, name, email and finally body. Now let's go to our free API service where we are going to declare a method which will make a get request. So let's declare a method get comments which will return an observable of type any. So since this is given an error because we have to import the observable from RxJS library. Also for making any HTTP request, we have to import the HttpClient from the Angular common HTTP library. Now in this class, we are going to inject the HttpClient using the constructor. So we are going to inject this HttpClient and create an instance of HttpClient. And in this get comments method, I'm going to simply write return this.httpClient, which is this instance, our HTTP client instance, and dot the get method, simple get method, and the bracket I'm simply going to pass the path of our API, which is nothing but this API. Now since we are ready with our get comments method, which is making an get request to our get API, we also have to import this service in our app module. So I'll quickly go to our app module TS. Here we are going to import our free API service. We'll declare the provider section here, and we'll put the free API service here in the provider so that it is available to all the components in the application. So now it's the time to call our API from our service from the app.component.ts file. So let's go to our app.component.ts file. So here we'll quickly import our free API service. Similarly, we'll inject our free API service here in the app component. So we have injected our free API service, and this is the instance of our free API service underscore free API service. Now, just to keep the things as simple as possible, I'm just going to write the onInit method in which we are going to directly call the service and display the data from the get API. So in this app component, I'm going to declare the onInit method. And now it's the time to call the service API. So I will just write this dot free API service dot get comments. Now this service will not be called unless I call the subscribe method. So I will just simply write dot subscribe. And when this subscribe method is called, whatever data which is received from the API will be declared here. That is in the data part. So I'm going to call this service, and I'm going to call this method from the service. The API will be invoked by the subscribe method, and whatever result will be returned from the API, which will be coming in the data section. And this data is nothing but is the data written from the REST API. So now, as you know, this get comments API returns us a list of repetitive fields like post ID, ID, name, email, and we have already created a class which will replicate all these fields, which is our comments.ts. So let's go to our app.component.ts file. Here in the app.component file, we'll just import the comments class. After this, we are going to declare a list of comments of type comments. So list of comments is a type of comments array. And in this data section, that is the data which is received from the API, we are simply going to write this dot list comments equal to data. That is, we are typecasting the data which is written from the API to our list. The data is nothing but it's also a JSON in form of a list, which we are typecasting to the list of comments. That is our comments class. Now, since we are done with our API call, we'll just simply go to our app.component.html file. And here we'll just put a style for display purpose. Here we'll just put an header, get request, and the API, that is simple API without any parameters. So we have to display whatever data we are going to receive from this API here. So I will just quickly declare a table. I will declare all the fields, the headers for all the fields, that is ID, post ID, name, email, and body. And now I'm going to display the data here. Here I'm going to simply write an ng for loop, ng for let com of list of comments. That is, I'm going to loop through all the data of this list of comments, and comment is the object. Now I'm going to display the value of all these fields, that is ID, post ID, name, email, and a body. So we are looping through all the fields. So you can see here we have created a service, free API.service. Here we have injected the HTTP client. and we are simply using the instance of the HTTP client, and by using this we are going to call the get API without any parameters. And in the app.components we are simply calling this service and this method by using the subscribe method, and whatever data we are received from the service we are assigning it to our list. And finally, in our app.component.html we are displaying that list. So let's run this. So I'm displaying all the records from our get API. That is a simple get API without any parameters. So now let's take an example of a get API with parameters. So let's go to JSON placeholder.typecode.com. This is providing us some free sample APIs. So you can take an example of this API, that is /post user ID equal to 1. Now this user ID is the parameter name and 1 is the value of this parameter. So we are going to make this API call, that is the get API call, and we are going to pass this parameter from our service. So let's see this API. So you can see here this is the get API with parameter, and it is returning a list with a repetitive fields, that is user ID, ID, title and body. So let's create a class which will replicate all these fields, that is user ID, ID, title and body. So I'll just go back to the classes folder. I'll just right click and create a new file named as post.ts. Now in this post.ts file, I will just create a class named as posts, and I will create all these fields of that API here: user ID, ID, title and body. So now let's go to our free API service.ts file. Here we are going to create another method for making a get request with parameter named as get comment by parameter, and which is also going to return an observable of type any. So the reason I am writing any here is because I'm not going to hard coding the return type. So in this case I can also write here the comments class, but I don't want it to hard code it. So I have written here any so that we can typecast it later. Now since we have declared our get comments by parameter method, we'll just go to our API. So we need to pass the parameter user ID. So for that we have to import the HttpParams from the Angular common HTTP. Now here we will simply write let param1, this is the variable, equal to new HttpParams dot, and I'm going to call the set method in which I'm going to pass this user ID, that is the get parameter. So I'm just going to write user ID comma and the value, that is 1. So let param1, that is the variable name, equal to new HttpParams dot set method, and I'm going to pass the parameter name, that is user ID, and its value, that is 1. So now finally I'm going to make that API call. I will just simply write return this dot HttpClient dot get. I will just simply pass the API path. Then I will just write curly braces. Inside that I will just write params colon, and I will just simply pass this param1 variable, that is here. So I'm going to just write this.httpClient.get the API path, and I'm going to pass this parameters, that is params, and the variable which is params1. Now since we are ready with our get comments by parameter method, we'll just call this in our app.component. So in the similar fashion, we are going to call this API just to keep it simple. So I'm just going to write this dot free API service dot get comments by param dot, I'm going to call the subscribe method, and finally I'm just going to write data. Now whatever data which is returned by this API, we are going to typecast here. So we have previously replicated the fields which we are getting from that API in form of this post class, which already have these parameters from the parameter API. So let's go to our app.component and quickly import the post class. And we'll quickly declare a list of posts of type post class array. And here in the data section, we are just going to typecast whatever data we are going to return from the API into this list of posts, which is of type posts. Now let's quickly go to our app.component.html. Here also we are going to define another header named as get request using parameter, and the path of our new API, get API with parameters. So let's display the data from this API, table, the headers for the fields of that API, that is ID, user ID, title and body. We'll declare a tr, and we'll loop through all the data from this list of posts using the ng for loop. And inside this, we are going to display the values of the fields like ID, user ID, title, and the body. Now we have already made this call in our ng onInit method to keep this simple. Now we'll run this application. So let's run this. So you can see that we have got the data from our another API, that is parameters API, and you can see the user ID, title and body. So now finally we will take the example of the post method. So let's go to our free API page. Let's see some examples here. So here we have a sample post API example. Here we have this path of our post API, which is accepting an object having three fields: title, body and user ID. And in return, after posting the data to this API, it will return an object having all these fields, that is ID, title, body and user ID. So the title, body and user ID remains the same what we have passing, but this ID will be returned as 101, which is hard coded since it's a sample API. So you can check here, we are giving title, body and user ID, and we are getting ID as 101 and the same title, body and user ID. So let's call this post API in our Angular project. So since this API takes title, body and user ID, we already created a post class having user ID, title and body. So I'll use this same post class for creating the object for posting to this API. So let's go to our app.component.ts class. So below this other API's call, we'll just simply declare an object of type posts. So here we'll just simply write where oPost equal to new post, that is of type of post class. Here we'll just simply write oPost.body equal to test body, oPost.title equal to test title, and oPost.user ID equal to 5. Now we'll go to our free API.service.ts, and here we will quickly import our post class. So we'll just write import posts from classes posts. Now here we'll simply declare the post method, that is post, name of the method is post, which is accepting an object of type post, and it will finally return an observable. So in this post method we'll simply write return this.httpClient, which is this dot, and we'll use the post method, and in the bracket we'll just simply pass the path of our API, which is this, and the object to be posted, that is comma oPost. Now we'll go to our app.component.ts file, and we'll quickly call this API in our Angie onInit method. So we'll just write this.freeAPI.service dot and our post method, and here we are going to pass the object, that is oPost, which it is expecting. And after this we'll have the data section. So now we are going to capture the object which is written from this post API. So let's declare an object of post of type posts, and in this API data section we'll simply write this dot object of post equal to data, that is whatever is written from this post API after posting the data to the API. Now in similar fashion we are going to display the data which is written from the post API in our HTML. So let's go to our app component.html file. Here we'll define another header, that is post data written from this API. So now we'll display the fields of an object which is written from the post API, that is objpost.id, the user ID, the title, and finally the body. So let's run this. Okay, so now you can see the post data returned, and you can see the ID as 102, the user ID which we have passed as 5, the title which was test title, and body as test data. Now we have got this ID field as 102 back from our post API, that is this. But if you check the console, you will see that cannot read the property ID of undefined. So this error is happening because you can see in the app.component that we are first calling the post API, and after receiving the data from the post API, we are assigning it to this.objPost. But in the HTML, we are accessing the objPost object before it has been even filled. So in the HTML, this objPost object is null. That's why it is throwing an error, because it is filled later when the post API is called. So to fix this error, we'll just simply write. So we'll just go back to our app.component.html and we'll simply write here question mark. That is, we are going to define it as nullable. Question mark, question mark, question mark. So this is just to fix our error of trying to access the property of null. So this object ID property will be available only when this objPost object is filled from the API. So now let's run this again. And you can see here that the error has gone. This is because we have declared it as nullable. So you can see we have ID, user ID, title and body. So in this way you can fix the undefined issue. So thus in this tutorial we have seen how to make a get request using parameters, and finally the post method. So that's it guys, thanks for watching. Kindly subscribe, like or share.